Okay. Today we want to wrap up our discussion of the First World War. I believe we concluded last time with this slide here. Is that correct? This all okay. Again, the point we would make here with the Treaty of Versailles. This is the treaty that officially ended. Let me rephrase that. This is the treaty that all of these nations agreed to. How the First World War would come to an end. The main point we would make here is that Germany was militarily defeated, and as the losers, they will be made to pay for this war, both in terms of guilt and responsibility, as well as financial compensation to the Allied nations. So Germany loses territory. Parts of the nation of Germany itself, the Rhineland, is demilitarized, meaning no German troops will be allowed into this territory permanently. All of the colonial possessions are gone, and again, the war guilt clause, the war was Germany's fault, they have to pay for it. Okay? Now, one other sort of development that we want to consider here is how the map changes after the war. We remember that World War I is going to see a creation of many new countries or nations, right? And primarily the countries are going to come from Eastern Europe. Okay, so all of these countries here in this very ugly mustard yellow is going to be are created during the Paris Peace Conference. Okay. Now, we do want to consider, I'll sort of give you a list of all of them here in just a moment so we kind of go through them. But I guess the question is, are they being created by the big three, that is Wilson and David Lloyd George and Clemenceau, the president of France? That is, did they get the magic marker out here and draw all these new boundaries? Well, no, that's not actually what happened. There was this, again, remember the repercussions of this nationalistic movement, this nationalism that people of a similar or, same culture, same language, religion, identity, to some extent tied to geography, they want their own country, they want their own nation. That's what Germany had done back in the 1870s. And again, much of World War I comes down to the big picture, Europe coming to terms with this new powerful Germany. So in the wake of that, there are all sorts of clamorings by many cultures throughout Europe, particularly coming out of Eastern Europe, who had lived as part of an empire, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they're going to be created as they are liberated from imperial control. All right. So it's not the big three, and just sort of pull these up just so we get them. It's not the big three going out there and drawing the boundaries. What's happening is these people are creating their own countries and then taking that to Paris for the big three to legitimize it. And to a large extent, the big three will do that. They'll legitimize this, right? They'll give their stamp of approval here. So remember, Russia, not part of the Treaty of Versailles, had been an allied nation, not part of the allied cause, but due to the problems of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, the collapse of the Tsarist regime under Nicholas II, Russia pulls out of the war. As a result, there was a tremendous hostility on the part of the Allied nations against Russia, so they were not invited to this conference either. But in their negotiations with Germany during 1917, as the Bolsheviks are successfully taking over under Lenin, they give up territory, not by choice, but by force, in the aftermath of this war. So Finland and Poland are created out of old Russian territory. Poland, particularly, an interesting story. Poland is, of all of the countries I'm going to show you, Poland is not a new country. In fact, it's an old country out of the Middle Ages. But it had been wiped off the map by the Russians back during the time of Peter the Great. And it is now back on the map, right? So tremendous Polish-Russian hostility that will be an issue in World War II as well, right? And then, I think one more, Estonia. The last three here, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, three small little states or nations on the Baltic Sea. They're sometimes called the Baltic states. They too will get their independence from Russian imperial control. Right? Now, the other big territory that is going to be carved up is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As losers in the war, new countries will be created, and the first two are rather obvious. The Austrian nation and the Hungarian nation are created. But then, excuse me, parts of the Eastern Europe that had been under Austro-Hungarian control are also created. Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia. Now, there are, excuse me, there are some very interesting consequences for the way these maps are redrawn. And particularly, one of the reasons why we're spending so much time on World War I is because, one, I don't think we spend enough time on this. World War II tends to get more of the highlights. Again, Holocaust, atom bomb, Nazis. It may deserve some of the bigger picture. But I think you get a lot more in World War II and just popular history and culture than you do World War I. But so much of the conflicts of the 20th century that we're going to keep looking at for the rest of the course come back to the First World War, right? And none more so than Czechoslovakia, okay? Because Czechoslovakia, first of all, that is two nations combined together, right? Today there is no Czechoslovakia, right? It's the Czech Republic and Slovakia. In this particular instance, the Czechs are the more powerful, the dominant force within these two cultures. They dominated the Slovakians and rallied together to create this country. But when they did this, it was sort of an act of opportunism. Here was a piece of Germany on the Czech Republic or the Czechoslovakian border that the Czechoslovakians themselves just grabbed, just took it. And that is the Sudetenland, right? The Sudetenland. Now, what the Sudetenland means is this is the land of the southern Germans. Sud is south, right? So this is part of Germany. And there are about 1 million Germans living in Sudetenland, now part of Czechoslovakia. So the problem with this, just imagine, here comes this guy, Adolf Hitler, in 1939, before the Holocaust, before World War II, clamoring for German self-determination, German nationalism. That is, Germans should live in Germany. And he is going to advocate that the Sudetenland be given back to Germany because it was stolen from Germany right here. So there's tension that's going to be created in the way the map is redrawn that will have repercussions for the Second World War. Unfortunately, the Sudetenland will be given back to Hitler, and he will then use it as a springboard to launch an invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia. So obviously that's going to be a big issue in the future. But again, German resentment that part of their country was stolen. Okay? Now, why did the Czechs do this? Because the Sudetenland is very rich in terms of mineral and irons and natural resources and things like this. So it was just an act of opportunism. The other thing we might consider is Yugoslavia. This too is a multi-ethnic nation, right? There's a lot of problems in Yugoslavia because they're the same problems under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Multiple ethnicities all forced to live together in one country. So if you take Yugoslavia, which means the land of the southern Slavs, right, and look at all of the cultures that are in Yugoslavia, right? If you divide this country sort of north and south, right, what kind of religious issues might we start to see there from sort of the religion of the north is going to be largely which religion?
Christian.
It's Christian, absolutely. And the southern? Muslim. All right, so from day one we have this sort of Muslim-Christian religious tension. If you look at the religion of the north, primarily, again, it's Christian, but divide that up. It's actually Catholic in the west and Eastern Orthodox in the east. So even within the Christian communities, there is tension. How about in terms of language? Multiple languages here, but even more basic than language is alphabet, right? The alphabet used in the eastern portion is not the Latin alphabet, that is the alphabet that English is written in, but it's the Cyrillic alphabet, which is the alphabet that the Russian language, for example, is written in. So you have, it's not just multicultural, multi-language, but multiple alphabets, multiple religions. And the point is that in order to keep all of that tension under wraps, a pretty harsh militaristic government is going to have to stay in power there or risk civil conflict. Now, throughout most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union will take care of that by, as a communist dictatorship, establishing that authoritarian control, keeping things more or less under check. But remember back in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, what happened to Yugoslavia? You guys remember Kosovo? You remember Serbia, Bosnia, this massive ethnic cleansing, this violence, this bloodbath, right? So remember that tension is sitting there for most of the 20th century, just simmering underneath the surface here, and all it takes is one sort of spark, the collapse of authoritarian control of the Soviet Union, to unleash a bloodbath that we're still dealing with today. Excuse me. All right. Now, the other thing that I want you to consider is, notice how all these countries form a nice little barrier between what and what? Between Russia and the West. Now, this is called the cordon sanitaire. Right up at the top there, the cordon sanitaire. So if you cordon off a street, you're blocking it off, right, for parades and stuff like that, right? So this is, a cordon sanitaire is a sanitary barrier. Because the West, remember the big three representing the West, they are quite happy to legitimize all of these countries because they form a barrier, not just to Russia, but more importantly to what? What's coming out of Russia? Communism. Communism. All right? And if you want a sense of how important communism was, or how, not important, but how afraid the West is of communism. Because remember, we're going to come back to this thing called the Cold War, this Soviet Union versus the United States, and people want to mix that up to somehow communism versus democracy. But it's not democracy, it's capitalism. That's an economic ideological warfare that's going to develop here over the next century. And these states, all of these new countries, form a barrier so that if communism tries to spread, it's going to have to go through these countries first as a buffer zone before it can get to the West. Okay? And that's the point in terms of, from the big three's perspective, is creating, legitimizing these countries because it forms a barrier to communism. Now, if you want an example of just, again, how afraid the West was of communism, during World War I, we'll see the rise of a very important British politician named Winston Churchill. Now, he is the one that goes on to become the Prime Minister during World War II. So we'll come back to Churchill, but his career really begins in earnest as the Minister of the Navy during the First World War. After this war is over, the First World War is over, he said something very telling. Now, remember, this World War I was a war between England against Germany. And the Russians were on the English side, at least at the beginning of the war. Remember these terms. The Hun, that's a reference sort of back to the medieval period, but it refers to the Germans, these sort of barbarians. The Hun are the Germans. The Bolsheviks, coming out of communist Russia, these are the people that the West is afraid of, the Bolshi, as Churchill liked to call them. Churchill said when World War I was over to kiss the Hun and shoot the Bolshi. Oh. Now, think about that for just a moment. We just had a war against the Hun, and the Bolshi were on our side, at least at the beginning. The Russians were on our side, right? But this filth of communism is so frightening to the West that whatever sort of militarism that Germany expressed during the First World War is nothing compared to the fear. Because ultimately the Germans are still what? They're still capitalists, right? This capitalist West is so afraid of communism coming in because communism is anathema, I mean, in direct contrast to everything capitalism stands for, or says it stands for, right? So the cordon sanitaire helps create that barrier to keep communism back, right? Okay, now I said that the Treaty of Versailles officially ended the First World War. That's not exactly a true statement, and we have to consider it's not a true statement for one country, and that's the United States. All of the other countries involved, it does. Okay? So remember that Wilson, this politician who led the American delegation to write out the Treaty of Versailles, he intentionally put the covenant of the League of Nations in the treaty, because surely once we hammer out this treaty, the Senate will ratify it. Right? Maybe. Let's consider this, right? Wilson also took how many Republicans with him? Zero Republicans, right? And he also was only able to get the League of Nations accepted by these European nations. All of the other 14 points flatly rejected, right? So Wilson felt like he had already compromised far more than he wanted to. He's not going to compromise any further. And that's just the death knell for any politician. You must be able to compromise to some degree. Okay, so for all of his negotiations in Paris, that doesn't mean anything until he brings this document back to the Senate, the Republican-controlled Senate, particularly controlled by Henry Cabot Lodge, that senator from Massachusetts, which he had insulted back in criticizing, saying senators were a lot like infants, right? Lodge controls the Senate. Now, the Senate is divided into three groups. There are Democrats, right? Remember that the Republicans in the 1918 election, so this off-year election, they had soundly defeated the Democrats. It was in many ways a rejection of the First World War, at least the policies initiated by the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. But there are clearly Wilson Democrats in the Senate, and they're going to do whatever Wilson says. They're going to accept the Treaty of Versailles as is. You then have a group of Republicans called the isolationists. Sometimes you hear them referred to as the irreconcilables, but it's the small minority of Republicans who reject the Treaty of Versailles. And they reject it from the perspective that they do not want to become involved any further in international affairs. They are, I use this word isolationist because that's pretty much the policy they advocate, is isolating ourselves back to North America, focus just on our commercial and political interests in North America, or at most the Western Hemisphere, and leave Europe and Asia and Africa to itself. Right? So they're not interested in the League of Nations, because that's going to create an international organization. So they're going to reject the Treaty of Versailles. But both the Democrats and the isolationists are clear minorities. What matters is this last group, the Republican nationalists. This is the majority of Republicans. This is Henry Cabot Lodge, the leader of the Senate's perspective. And what they say, excuse me, I'm sort of fighting a cold here. What they're going to argue is they don't have a problem necessarily with the League of Nations. Remember the new diplomacy. New diplomacy is access to foreign markets. It's about commercial expansion. It's about imperialism. It's about spreading U.S. influence. I mean, the whole point. Remember, Henry Cabot Lodge, one of his best friends is Theodore Roosevelt, right? These are guys that wanted to promote American strength and power on a world stage. So they can absolutely see the value of the League of Nations, particularly if the United States has a pretty influential role in it, right? But they do have some concerns about the framing or the wording of the Covenant of the League of Nations, particularly here back to that Article 10 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. Right? Now remember, Article 10 suggested or stated that this is the provision that talked about collective security, right? And this was sort of the main point of the League of Nations, to serve as a deterrent for future conflict. So Article 10 said that if the principle of collective security was that if one member of the League of Nations is threatened or attacked by an aggressive nation, the rest of the members would come to their aid, punish the aggressive nation, and help the nation that got invaded, and kind of restore the balance of power. Right? So the point is that if you knew that was going to happen or likely to happen as an aggressive state, you might rethink your decision to invade somebody. Now, exactly how that works is back to that executive council, right? 5 permanent seats, the United States is one of them, and 4 rotating seats. So an actual decision to use collective force would initiate in the executive council. And any one of those permanent seats have the right to veto in any decision. Doesn't matter what the vote is, you can veto it. Okay? The problem from the Republicans is what person actually casts that veto vote? Who gets to do that? Who, in essence, who makes that decision to use collective security or not? Well, the way it's written, the President of the United States gets to do that. Which means, who's going to get to do that? Wilson would get to do that. And this was the concern that the Republicans had. I think a very reasonable concern. That Wilson is going to want to show the effectiveness of the League. Right? So imagine a scenario where one country attacked another country, and now you have to make a decision about whether or not to use collective security and punish the aggressive nation. What's the likelihood that Wilson's going to say, no, let's not do that here because I don't want to show you how this works, right? Probably not very likely. And at least that was the concern of the Republicans, that Wilson is going to want to demonstrate the effectiveness of the League, and it might get us involved in a war unnecessarily, okay? So they're not saying get rid of Article 10. They're not saying don't join the League. What they're saying is let's just amend it, compromise, so that the vote for using collective security is taken out of the hands of the president, one man who created the whole thing, and put it into the Senate. All right? Now, again, on the one hand, that's, well, maybe the senators are just trying to grab power for themselves, but at least keep this in mind. There's going to be a vote taken. There's going to be negotiation. There's going to be debate, right? Again, representative government here. The senators will have to negotiate amongst themselves before casting this decision whether or not to use collective security. It seemed rather reasonable compared to one man having this decision, particularly the guy that wants to show you whether it works or not. So the Republicans said, look, let's just change the wording of this, and we will support it. Wilson's response? No. He absolutely refused to compromise. So Wilson actually tries to go above the heads of the senators, and he goes on a public speaking tour across the United States. And basically what he's trying to do is campaign for the Treaty of Versailles as is, and stir up public support, get these people to put pressure on their senators to pass it as is. That's what he's trying to do. Excuse me. Well, he's out in New Mexico on one of these big campaigns trying to stir up public support for the article, for the League of Nations, and he suffered a massive stroke. It more or less debilitated him for the rest of his life. They rush him back to Washington, D.C. They put him in the back room of the White House. And Wilson is more or less kept out of public sight for the remainder of his term in office into March of 1921. Right? Now, there's going to be an election in 1920, but inaugurations are in March at this time. Now, interestingly enough, the Senate goes ahead with the vote, as is, and rejected the treaty. It did not pass the Treaty of Versailles. It did not ratify. Think of the irony of this. Because ultimately, in defeating the treaty, in not ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, we did not join the League of Nations. We are the only country involved in the Paris Peace Conference that did not join the League of Nations, and yet we were the ones, Wilson was the one who created it. Right? We were the only ones that didn't join it. Second of all, I said that the Treaty of Versailles officially ended World War I. It did for everybody that ratified it. We did not. So what this technically means, this is not a military issue or anything like that, but technically, we're still at war with Germany because we have not signed the peace treaty ending the war. We will have to create an entirely separate peace treaty with Germany, which we will sign 1920, 21, somewhere around in there, ending the war for us. So the treaty was defeated because of Wilson's unwillingness to compromise over a fairly reasonable demand by the Republican Senate. Take the veto vote out of the hands of the president and put it in the hands of the Republicans. Wilson rejected it. He lost. All right. Okay, by the way, Wilson, very interestingly enough, he had had some very serious health issues for a lot of his adult life. First of all, as a child, he suffered from dyslexia. Now, again, they didn't know it at the time, which, again, is just kind of a reading, learning disorder. You kind of invert letters and stuff. It made reading hard for him, right? Which is why he then went into debate and public speaking to compensate, and that's, again, why he wanted to become a professor and then a politician. So it actually served him well, but it was something that he had to overcome, this dyslexia. But he had what we might call today minor strokes earlier in his life as well, to the point where he had lost vision, lost vision in one of his eyes later in life. His doctor told him, due to his health problems, that you need to sort of retire and live a mostly stress-free life if you want to have quality years ahead of you. Instead, he went on to become governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States and led us through World War I, right? So again, not exactly the best health decision that he had. And it cost him. He had this massive stroke out in New Mexico, and it more or less debilitated him for the rest of his years. Interestingly enough, too, when he's back in the White House, they didn't tell everybody exactly what was going on here. And so decisions that were being made from the president, we found out years later, of course, that it wasn't him at all. He was out of it. He didn't know what was going on. His wife, Edith, was actually making some executive presidential decisions, somebody who was not elected to do that, right? But they had tried to keep this secret because there was some sort of hope that maybe he would run for election in 1920, which is not going to work out. All right. So the treaty is defeated. Wilson himself is a very unpopular president at the end of his presidency because I think there was a tremendous amount of unsatisfaction and lack of popular support for the war itself. And so the Democrats, notice too, the Democrats are going to lose power again, as we said, and we're going to talk about this later in the 1920s, but the Republicans are going to unite and dominate throughout the 1920s, and some of the reason for that is because the Democrats take the political hit of an unpopular war, right? Just as the Democrats took the political hit from the Depression back in the 1890s, right, with Grover Cleveland, right? Okay, now let's back up just a little bit here. We've sort of got the war and the aftermath of the war laid out, but I want to maybe just a snapshot here of what was going on in the United States during the war. That is some of the domestic issues here and its impact on American society. Because World War I, First World War, raises a lot of constitutional issues, civil liberties issues, free speech issues, censorship issues, the power and authority of a very large government, silencing free speech. So we think of, for example, let me just pull all this stuff up here, the Committee on Public Information. Now that sounds like a really useful organization who, from the title, suggests that they're here to inform the public. No. This is a propaganda machine by the government to promote the war and silence anti-war protests. All right? It was sometimes referred to as the Creel Committee because this man here, George Creel, was in charge of it. So Creel Committee, or the Committee on Public Information. If you want just a kind of a sense of what the agenda was, just look at Creel's background. His background is in advertising, all right? And advertising is designed to do what? Persuade you to buy something, right? In this instance, buy support for the war. So notice that you didn't have a Committee on Public Information's organization back during the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was a popular war. It was a good war, right? if we can call wars good. This was an unpopular war. We're going to have to draft soldiers, right? They will not have enough soldiers volunteer for this war. They'll have to be forced to fight, right? So the Committee on Public Information was really designed to promote the war, sent around thousands of men to give little speeches at the beginning of films, Hollywood theaters, things like that, trying to drum up support for the war, right? Well, along with that, once we declared war in 1917, the Espionage Act was passed. Now, the Espionage Act, and we'll just sort of put it up here along with its sort of sister legislation, the Sedition Act. The Espionage Act, now what is espionage? Well, espionage is spying on people, right? So this sounds, again, like a positive step. You want to, prevent spying on, the American government or the American military in a time of war, particularly. So that, again, notice the power of words here, right? Naming, right? The Espionage Act was not about prosecuting spying. The Espionage Act was about silencing anti-war protesters. So if you in any way interfered with the war effort, you could be prosecuted and go to jail. So if, for example, you told young men to not sign up for the draft, right? That is to avoid the draft. You were interfering with the prosecution and execution of this war, and you yourself could then face trial under the Espionage Act and go to prison. And in fact, that is what Eugene Debs, remember that socialist from Labor Railroad, what he is sent to prison for. He is sent to prison because he gave a speech telling young men not to sign up for this war, right? And because he interfered, he went to prison with a 10-year sentence. By the way, he ran for president in prison and received almost 1 million votes. All right? The Sedition Act was then passed in 1918, a much broader and much vaguer law. A much more vague law, in which it said any criticism of the government or the president in a time of war was prosecutable, meaning that you too could go to prison for that if the courts decided. So remember what Wilson had said. This war was a war, and in terms of why we're fighting it, why we had to fight it, was a war to make the world safe for democracy. And yet at the same time, we enact some very undemocratic laws, particularly cracking down on free speech and the First Amendment, during the war, right? Now, again, just sort of think about how do you reconcile those two things? That we're fighting the war to make the world safe for democracy, and at the heart of democracy is public participation and free speech, and yet we crack down on that if you go against the war at home, right? Inherently, this is a paradox that's hard to reconcile, right? And by the way, this is not uncommon. This happens in many wars, right? The justification is that we must limit civil liberties and civil rights in order to successfully prosecute the war. And once the war is over, your rights will come back, hopefully, right? It's you have to be very careful about this. When rights go away, it's oftentimes they don't come back, right? Or they come back in modified forms. You have to be very careful about this, right? It is rather interesting. There are a lot of court cases coming out of World War I. And they are all, of course, challenging this free speech in the First Amendment. Right? Now, it is very interesting, the legal argument here. And I don't know if I have this or not. I don't. Okay. There's a phrase here that you ought to write down, and I'll tell it to you. Because this does go before the Supreme Court, questioning the validity, the constitutionality, of the Espionage Act. Does it violate First Amendment right to free speech? And the Supreme Court unanimously said that the Espionage Act does not violate one's right to free speech. And here's why. Again, this is a legal argument. Doesn't make it right. Doesn't make it wrong. It's a legal argument, which means it's an interpretation of the Constitution. All right? And the decision here is that the First Amendment does not give you the right to say whatever you want. What it gives you, right, Congress shall pass no law abridging one's right to free speech. All right? And there's a subtle difference there if you're looking for a loophole. Because what the argument is, the legal phrase is that the federal government will use to defend the Espionage Act is, and this is what you want to write down, no prior restraint. No prior restraint. All right? Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that the federal government did not restrain you, meaning stop you, from saying something before you said it. You can say whatever you want. The Constitution does not protect you from being prosecuted after you say it. Now think about that for just a moment. Government didn't come in and cut your tongue off to prevent you from saying. You say whatever you want. But they also then reserve the right, according to this interpretation, to punish you after you say it. Which is exactly what happens here. Right? Now again, that's a legal loophole. Because in fact, if I know that I might be punished after I say something, like the Espionage Act, might I reconsider what I'm about to say? Yeah, I would, right? Or could. And therefore, there was a law passed that abridged one's right to free speech, but that's not how the Supreme Court interpreted it. And this is why, again, we talk about, elections are coming up very soon, right? And we get so wrapped up in elections, which are important, right? Make sure you vote. But if you want to understand, the rights that you have are not what you think they are. The rights that you have are based upon the decisions and interpretation of 9 Supreme Court justices. Your rights are what they say they are, right? And this is, again, the power of the Supreme Court and the power of judges themselves to interpret law goes far beyond any politician's, 2 or 4 or 6 year term of office, right? Because they serve for life, right? And again, our legal system is based upon precedent. Decisions of this court affects future decisions, right? So the Espionage and Sedition Act tremendously cracked down. About 900 people are prosecuted and sent to prison, right? And even when the war was over, Wilson had, again, there was a lot of pressure on him to commute Debs' sentence. He had served about a year and a half, 2 years in prison in Virginia. Wilson wasn't here, correct? He's going to serve his 10 years. The next president came in, did release Debs, but not Wilson, right? Now, let's also consider sort of you got to stir up support for the war, right? In an unpopular war, governments get fairly desperate, right? So you can always turn to the media, right? And again, this is not quite the golden age of Hollywood, but it's pretty close, 1920s. To hell with the Kaiser, right? Somehow, again, linking the Kaiser to the devil, right? Again, you're fighting a moral crusade, democracy versus, right, I guess, satanic dictatorship or something like that. Again, that phrase, the Hun, right, referring to the Germans, halt the Hun. The best way to do that? Buy a liberty bond, right? Buy a war bond, because again, usually the nations with the most money win wars, right? But notice the image here too. All right, here's a Hun, German. And what are we protecting? our women and children, right? They're going to get your women and children, right? Well, they're actually over in Germany. They're not. You never know, right? This is my favorite one. Stirring up support for the war. You guys can see this. Destroy this mad brute. So they take an ape and put a German war helmet, and there's a club that says Kultur, which is culture in German. And what does he have? Yeah, what are we tapping into here? Well, who is oftentimes, in a very racist manner, portrayed as monkeys and African American males, right? So what we have here is an image. And we kind of look at it and go, what's going on? Every white male in the South understood exactly what this image was about. That is, what is the one fear? I'm talking obsessive fear that white Southern males have, is that black men are going to rape our white women, right? And notice who's in danger here, a white woman, right? So all you do is take that pre-existing racism and hatred and put a German helmet on. And suddenly you can transfer, because notice, getting people, put it this way, despite the fact that it happens all the time, getting a human to kill another human is not an easy thing to do. Right? Now, guns make it much easier because it's from a distance, but there is a certain mindset that usually has to go along with soldiers that you're actually not killing people, you're killing animals or people that are less than human. You have to dehumanize the enemy to make it acceptable to kill them. So again, it is the dehumanization in this instance of German soldiers, that they're nothing really but apes, but you're tapping into pre-existing racism and hatred that neither are African American males. They too are animals, right? And worthy of the treatment that they're getting, particularly in the segregated South, right? So if you want to protect your white women, you got to go defeat the Germans, right? Again, tapping into pre-existing categories of racism that, you're just slightly shifting the focus is all you're doing, but it's long-standing traditions of racism going on there, right? Again, you see that this is really about trying to get money for the war support, right? So again, help Uncle Sam stamp out the Kaiser and these sorts of things. But the point is trying to be a good, loyal, patriotic American and donate to the war cause, right? Very interestingly, when the war is over, this is a political cartoon here where it talks about the new Hun menace, right? So it's no longer Germany, but what's the new menace? Unions, organized labor, strikes. Now, interestingly as well, again, it's this idea of sort of transferring existing patterns of negativity or hatred or racism or just ignorance and fear. Because what can you sort of connect strikes back to that we're now going to have to fight and be on guard against? Unions are very similar to what other sort of ideology? Communism, socialism. Because notice the language that they both use. What is the power of a union? Its power is its numbers, the collective, right? What is the sort of power of socialism, communism? It is their numbers. It is about organizing masses of people, right? Now again, unions are not socialist. Unions are not revolutionary. I mean, the IWW is, but unions are really just a way for capitalism to reform itself by giving concessions so that they can continue to make the money they've always been making, right? But now, all you have to do with the whole fear of communism coming out of Russia is take that brush, the fear of communism, and spread it across labor unions, and it's the exact same thing, right? We have to destroy unions. We have to prevent people from organizing, because if we allow them to do this, next thing you know, Lenin and the Bolsheviks will be right over here, right? So again, you can transfer that sort of animosity to communism back onto unions, right? The other thing that begins to develop, this is 1918, 1919, in the end of the war, we have something called the Red Scare. And again, this is sort of this is happening here so that you can transfer your fear of communism to labor unions. But the Red Scare was the fear that the communists are everywhere and they're here to take over, right? So watch your neighbor. Pay attention to what they're doing. Any suspicious behavior, make sure you report that, right? Because there's a communist under every mattress, and we need to make sure we keep them, keep them at bay here. So the Red Scare was this excessive paranoia and fear that communists are going to take over the world, particularly the United States. Right? Now, you can again link that not just to labor unions, but you see this guy back here, in general, European immigrants. So if you have people in the 19-teens who are not citizens yet, right, and they're considering joining a labor union, all you got to do is threaten them with what? Deportation under the Red Scare, that you just accuse them of being a communist, and they're going to either be deported, and all you got to do is put a few to get everybody else to comply, and it gets them to not join unions. It gets them to not be an agitator because they don't want to be sent back to their country of origin, right? So the Red Scare is a movement here, fear of communism, that can be manipulated very easily to go after labor unions, after immigrants, about agitators, about anti-war protesters. Basically anybody that bucks the system, just label them a communist. And it doesn't really matter if they're a communist or not. You've already accused them, right? The responsibility to defend themselves, right? That it's sort of you're guilty until you prove your innocence instead of the other way around. Now, what fueled this, of course, was the bomb scares that take place, particularly May 1st, 1919, May Day, right? This is A. Mitchell Palmer. He was the Attorney General under Wilson. And to the right is his house that, in fact, received bombs, right? Mail bombs, right? And they blew up. So there was just enough legitimate evidence here, right? And all you need is a little bit to sort of cast this wide aspersions that there are communists everywhere. So this then allows the federal government, and A. Mitchell Palmer as Attorney General will lead this, to go after immigrants and labor unions and socialists and anarchists and communists and basically anybody that might be seen as subversive, right? You deport people, right? And that's what happened here. This is the famous Soviet Ark. It's the USS Buford. It's an Army transport ship, but on board are hundreds of Russian immigrants who are deported back to Russia simply because it was a way to crack down on all the remaining immigrants in the United States, that if you disobey or challenge the system or organize or stand up for your rights or protest or complain or basically say anything against the government, we will deport you as well. Right? So this was called the Soviet Ark, right, because they were returning many Russian immigrants back to Russia, right? Many of whom were not communists in any way, shape, or form, right? But again, this is the idea here, it's the fear, okay? So it was rather interesting here, kind of wrap this up with Eugene Debs. He went to prison, as we said, for violating, you don't need to write that down, but it gives you just a sense of what he's talking about here, right? He went to prison for violating the Espionage Act. And, of course, when he's on the stand, he didn't deny it. He absolutely said, yeah, I tried to make sure these men would not fight this war. Because he said that, wars are often the master class, meaning the rich, are the ones who declare wars. But it is the working class, the poor, that end up fighting these wars, right? And these wars are largely fought for the benefit of the rich and powerful at the expense of the poor, right? Again, it's a class mentality that he's advocating here. So he said, and this is how he concluded his address to the court in Virginia, right? Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free, right? A really dangerous sentiment here, right? And again,